October 3, 1943. Occupied France, Sark Island, Channel Islands. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber stood in the stone courtyard of the requisitioned manor house that served as his headquarters, reading the directive that had arrived from regional command with mounting disbelief. The document, stamped with security classifications that indicated its serious nature, contained instructions he would have dismissed as paranoid fantasy just 18 months earlier. Detailed protocols for defending against British commando raids, including specific warnings about their tactics, capabilities, and the psychological impact of their operations. The language was stark, stripped of the confident rhetoric that had characterized earlier war directives. Do not underestimate these forces, the document warned. Previous intelligence assessments have proven inadequate. Commandos operate with training and equipment standards that match or exceed our own special forces. Garrison commanders who fail to take this threat seriously will be held personally responsible for resulting casualties and operational failures. Weber had been a professional soldier for 15 years, had served in Poland and France, had earned his commission through competence rather than political connections. He knew how rare it was for Wehrmacht command to issue warnings that implicitly acknowledged German forces might be outmatched. Yet here it was, in official documentation bearing the signatures of officers whose careers depended on projecting confidence, an admission that the enemy they'd been taught to dismiss had become something they needed to fear. The evolution of German military attitudes toward British commandos represented one of the war's most dramatic intelligence failures and institutional learning experiences. In 1940, when Winston Churchill first ordered the creation of special raiding forces to strike occupied Europe, German intelligence dismissed the initiative as British desperation, a propaganda gesture designed to maintain morale among a defeated nation that had been evacuated from Dunkirk and stood alone against the Wehrmacht's continental dominance. Intelligence assessments distributed to occupation forces characterized commandos as poorly trained volunteers, conducting harassment raids of no strategic significance, incapable of sustained operations or meaningful tactical impact. This dismissive attitude reflected broader German assumptions about British military capabilities, rooted in ideological prejudice rather than objective analysis. The Third Reich's propaganda apparatus had invested heavily in narratives portraying Britain as a declining empire whose military effectiveness had been permanently shattered by German victories. British soldiers were characterized as unmotivated conscripts from a class-divided society, lacking the ideological commitment and physical conditioning that supposedly distinguished Wehrmacht forces. The Royal Navy, while numerically significant, was described as cautious and tradition-bound, incapable of the aggressive naval operations that would be required to support commando raids deep into occupied territory. British industry, supposedly crippled by bombing campaigns and resource shortages, couldn't possibly produce the specialized equipment that effective special operations would require. German occupation forces in France, Norway, the Channel Islands, and across the Mediterranean operated within this comfortable framework of assumptions. Garrison duty in 1940 and early 1941 followed relaxed protocols based on the assessment that serious Allied military action against occupied territories was years away, if it came at all. Coastal defenses received low priority in resource allocation. Training exercises focused on conventional warfare scenarios rather than countering infiltration or rapid assault. Security measures assumed the primary threat came from local resistance, disorganized, poorly armed civilians, rather than professional military forces with naval support and specialized training. The soldiers assigned to these occupation posts came from varied backgrounds: veterans resting from combat operations, older reservists considered suitable for garrison duty, and fresh recruits completing training in relatively safe environments before potential deployment to more active theaters. They had been conditioned through official briefings, propaganda films, and the entire institutional culture of the Wehrmacht to view themselves as members of an invincible military force occupying defeated territories against negligible external threats. The possibility that British forces might conduct successful offensive operations against their positions existed so far outside their operational framework that no serious planning addressed it. Weber's own journey from confidence to concern had begun, not with direct experience but with accumulating reports that contradicted everything his training had taught him about British military capabilities. The first incidents had been easy to dismiss. A small raid on the Lofoten Islands in Norway during March 1941, which German command characterized as an isolated propaganda gesture that achieved minimal tactical objectives. When British forces struck Vogtsøy 9 months later in Operation Archery, the official response remained dismissive, despite evidence of sophisticated coordination and effective execution. Weber, stationed in occupied France at the time, had read the after-action reports with professional interest but without particular concern. These were events happening in remote Norwegian garrisons, not serious operations that threatened Wehrmacht control of occupied Europe. The raid on Saint-Nazaire in March 1942 began shifting his perspective. British commandos had penetrated one of the most heavily defended ports in occupied France, destroyed the massive Normandy dry dock with an explosive-laden destroyer converted into a floating bomb, and inflicted damage that would prevent its use for the remainder of the war. The tactical audacity of the operation, ramming a destroyer into dock gates while under fire, then having it explode hours later, killing German personnel who had boarded to investigate, suggested planning sophistication and operational boldness that contradicted assessments of British caution and limited capability. More disturbing were the casualty reports. The British had accepted horrific losses to achieve their objective, demonstrating a willingness to sacrifice personnel for strategic goals that intelligence briefs had insisted British leadership lacked. The Dieppe raid in August 1942, while ultimately a British tactical failure with massive casualties, further complicated German assessments. The operation demonstrated that Allied forces were willing and able to conduct large-scale amphibious assaults against heavily defended positions, a capability that would be essential for any future invasion of occupied Europe. Even in failure, the raid revealed British possession of specialized landing craft, coordinated naval ground-air planning capabilities, and institutional commitment to offensive operations that required years of preparation and resource investment. German commanders began quietly questioning whether previous intelligence assessments had been based on wishful thinking, rather than accurate evaluation of enemy capabilities. Weber noticed a subtle shift in the tone of official communications during this period. Directives that had previously radiated confidence began including cautionary language about commando threats. Training exercises started incorporating scenarios involving infiltration and rapid assault. Coastal garrisons received orders to improve defensive positions and increase security protocols. The changes came without explicit acknowledgement that previous assessments had been wrong. Institutional pride prevented such admissions, but the practical implications were clear. German command was belatedly recognizing that British special forces represented a genuine operational threat. The turning point in German military attitudes came not from a single operation, but from the accumulation of intelligence gathered from prisoners, captured documents, and after-action analysis that revealed the systematic nature of British commando development. German interrogators, interviewing captured commandos, discovered that these weren't desperate volunteers or propaganda constructs, but products of sophisticated selection and training programs that rivaled or exceeded German special forces standards. The commandos trained in Scotland at specialized facilities, undergoing months of conditioning in mountain warfare, amphibious operations, close-quarters combat, demolitions, and small unit tactics that emphasized initiative, adaptability, and aggressive action under extreme conditions. The captured documents proved even more revealing. British planning materials demonstrated detailed intelligence about German defensive positions, suggesting espionage networks that German counterintelligence had failed to detect or neutralize. Training manuals showed institutional investment in commando capabilities as permanent military assets, rather than temporary expedients. Supply requisitions indicated specialized equipment development, silenced weapons, waterproof explosives, portable radios, assault craft, that required industrial capacity supposedly crippled by German bombing campaigns. The evidence accumulated into an unavoidable conclusion. Britain had not only maintained offensive military capability despite years of war, but had developed specialized forces specifically designed to exploit Wehrmacht vulnerabilities in occupied territories. For officers like Weber, this intelligence created profound cognitive dissonance. They had built their careers within an institutional culture that emphasized German military superiority as ideological fact, rather than tactical assessment requiring continuous validation. Acknowledging that British forces had achieved parity or superiority in specialized warfare capabilities meant questioning fundamental assumptions about national and racial hierarchies that undergirded Nazi ideology. Yet operational necessity demanded honest evaluation of threats regardless of ideological preferences. Garrison commanders who ignored commando capabilities out of ideological commitment to British inferiority found their positions overrun, their troops captured, and their careers ended in disgrace or worse. The regime had little tolerance for failures that contradicted its narrative of invincibility. The institutional response took characteristic form. German command began issuing warnings about commando capabilities, while simultaneously maintaining public propaganda about British weakness, creating a bifurcated reality where operational directives contradicted official narratives. Classified briefings described commandos as highly trained professionals requiring serious defensive measures. Public broadcasts continued portraying British forces as demoralized remnants of a defeated military. Officers learned to navigate between these contradictory frameworks, speaking different truths in different contexts, a skill that proved essential for career survival in a regime that couldn't tolerate evidence contradicting its ideology, but also couldn't afford operational failures resulting from willful ignorance of enemy capabilities. Weber's transfer to Sark Island and the Channel Islands brought him face to face with the practical implications of the Wehrmacht's belated recognition of commando threats. The Channel Islands, occupied since 1940, had initially been garrisoned with minimal forces based on assumptions that British forces wouldn't waste resources attacking strategically insignificant territory so close to English shores. By 1943, those assumptions had been revised drastically. Sark's garrison had been reinforced, defensive positions improved, security protocols tightened, and Weber himself had been selected for command specifically because of his combat experience and demonstrated competence in following security directives that previous commanders had treated as excessive paranoia. His first days on the island involved familiarizing himself with defensive positions, while simultaneously reading after-action reports from previous commando raids that had struck nearby islands. The reports painted a disturbing picture of British operational methods. Commandos landed at night using specialized craft that evaded radar detection, moved inland with detailed knowledge of German defensive positions, accomplished specific objectives with surgical precision, and withdrew before reinforcements could arrive. They captured prisoners for interrogation, gathered intelligence about defensive capabilities, and demonstrated apparent immunity to the coastal defense systems that were supposed to make amphibious operations suicidal. Each successful raid served dual purposes, achieving tactical objectives while simultaneously undermining German garrison troops' confidence in their security. The psychological impact on his soldiers proved as significant as any tactical threat. These were men who had been assured of their safety on islands that British forces supposedly lacked the capability to threaten, yet they now performed their duties knowing that commandos had already struck Jersey, Guernsey, and smaller islands with apparent ease, that their defensive positions might be compromised by British intelligence, that they could wake to find enemy forces already inside their perimeter. The constant tension, knowing you're vulnerable but not knowing when or if attack will come, eroded morale more effectively than actual combat would have. Soldiers became jumpy, overreacting to routine occurrences, expending psychological energy on threat vigilance that left them exhausted, even in absence of actual enemy action. Weber implemented the security protocols mandated by his orders, while observing their impact on unit cohesion and effectiveness. Increased patrols meant reduced rest periods. Heightened security measures created friction with local civilians whose cooperation was essential for intelligence gathering. The defensive improvements required construction work that diverted manpower from training and maintenance. Every measure taken to counter commando threats imposed costs on garrison effectiveness, yet failing to implement these measures meant accepting unacceptable vulnerability to enemy action. He was managing a garrison trapped between competing imperatives, trying to maintain operational readiness against conventional threats while simultaneously preparing for unconventional attacks that might never come but could prove catastrophic if they did. The directive Weber had received contained specific tactical guidance based on hard lessons learned from previous commando raids. German intelligence had compiled a detailed profile of British operational methods through systematic analysis of successful operations. Commandos favored dark nights with poor weather that grounded air patrols and limited visibility. They approached by sea using small craft that hugged coastlines to minimize radar exposure. They landed at points intelligence indicated were lightly defended or inadequately monitored. They moved inland along routes suggesting detailed knowledge of terrain and defensive positions. They struck specific high-value targets: officers' quarters, communication facilities, ammunition depots, with precision indicating extensive pre-operation reconnaissance. The countermeasures recommended reflected German command's growing respect for commando capabilities. Coastal patrols were to be randomized to prevent pattern identification. Officers were instructed to vary their locations and routines to complicate targeting. Communication facilities required enhanced security and backup systems. Defensive positions needed interlocking fields of fire to prevent infiltration without detection. Perhaps most significantly, the directive emphasized speed of response. Commandos operated on tight timelines, and delays in German reaction time gave them operational windows to complete objectives and withdraw. Garrison forces were ordered to maintain quick reaction teams prepared for immediate deployment, regardless of time or conditions. Weber studied these recommendations with professional interest and mounting concern. They represented sound tactical doctrine for countering special operations, but implementing them required resources and personnel his garrison didn't possess in sufficient quantity. He could randomize patrols only by reducing their frequency or coverage area. He could enhance security at critical facilities only by reducing it elsewhere. He could maintain quick reaction teams only by pulling soldiers from other essential duties. Every improvement in one area created vulnerability in another, forcing constant calculations about acceptable risk that kept him awake reviewing defensive maps and trying to anticipate where commandos would strike if they came. The directive also contained something unusual for Wehrmacht communications: explicit acknowledgement that previous intelligence had been wrong and that field commanders should trust their own tactical judgment over outdated assessments. This represented remarkable institutional humility for an organization that had built its culture around centralized authority and doctrinal certainty. Reading between the lines, Weber understood the message. German command knew their earlier dismissals of commando capabilities had gotten soldiers killed and positions overrun. They were now authorizing garrison commanders to implement whatever defensive measures they deemed necessary, even if those measures implicitly contradicted official narratives about British weakness. Operational reality had forced institutional acknowledgement that the enemy was formidable, professional, and dangerous, a truth that couldn't be spoken publicly, but had to be acted upon privately to prevent catastrophic failures. On the night of October 3-4, 1943, Weber's theoretical preparations confronted operational reality, when British commandos from the small-scale raiding force landed on Sark as part of Operation Basalt. The raid unfolded with characteristics that validated every warning in the security directives. The commandos approached during a moonless night with poor weather conditions, landed at a lightly defended beach, moved inland with apparent knowledge of German positions, and struck their objectives with coordinated precision. Weber, awakened by the sound of gunfire and explosive charges, experienced in compressed hours the psychological journey that had taken the Wehrmacht years to complete. From confident assumption of superiority to shocked recognition of enemy capabilities that exceeded expectations. The commandos captured several German soldiers before Weber's quick reaction team could respond, killed others who resisted, and withdrew to their boats with prisoners and intelligence materials before reinforcements from neighboring positions could arrive. The entire operation lasted less than 2 hours, yet in that brief window they achieved multiple objectives. They gathered intelligence about garrison strength and defensive positions. They captured prisoners for interrogation about broader German operations. And they demonstrated that even heavily fortified islands with enhanced security protocols remained vulnerable to well-executed special operations. Most significantly, from a psychological perspective, they proved that all of Weber's preparations and security measures hadn't been sufficient to prevent infiltration and successful enemy action. The aftermath of the raid forced Weber to confront uncomfortable questions about the effectiveness of conventional defensive measures against unconventional threats. His garrison had implemented every recommended security protocol: enhanced patrols, improved communications, quick reaction teams, randomized procedures. Yet the commandos had still accomplished their mission with apparent ease, suffering no casualties while inflicting losses on German forces and escaping with prisoners and intelligence. The failure wasn't due to laziness or incompetence. His troops had followed orders and maintained defensive discipline. The failure stemmed from something more fundamental. The commandos possessed tactical advantages: superior training in small unit operations better intelligence about German positions, specialized equipment for covert infiltration that conventional garrison forces couldn't effectively counter without fundamentally restructuring their entire operational approach. What disturbed Weber most wasn't the tactical defeat, but what it revealed about the broader military situation. If British forces could conduct successful raids against heavily defended Channel Islands just miles from occupied France, what did that suggest about their capabilities for larger operations? If they possessed intelligence networks providing detailed information about German defensive positions, how extensive were those networks, and what other operational secrets had been compromised? If their commandos operated with this level of professional competence, what did that imply about the quality of their conventional forces that would eventually participate in the invasion everyone knew was coming? The investigation following Operation Basalt revealed details that compounded Weber's concerns about Wehrmacht vulnerability to commando operations. British forces had approached Sark with detailed maps showing not just military installations, but also the locations where German personnel typically gathered, suggesting human intelligence networks that German counter-espionage had failed to detect. They had timed their raid to coincide with a period when weather conditions grounded German air patrols, indicating meteorological planning that required sophisticated forecasting capabilities. They had used suppressed weapons and coordinated hand signals that allowed them to operate in near silence, maintaining surprise even when moving through areas within earshot of German positions. Most concerningly, they had withdrawn with German prisoners despite the prisoners being bound according to standard security protocols. The commandos had prepared bolt cutters and procedures for extracting captives, anticipating obstacles and planning solutions before the operation even began. The level of planning and preparation evident in the raid's execution forced Weber to reconsider his assumptions about the nature of modern warfare. Traditional military doctrine emphasized force concentration, firepower superiority, and momentum in offensive operations. The commandos operated according to different principles: precision over mass, intelligence over strength, speed over sustained engagement. They had transformed military operations into something closer to surgical procedures, carefully planned interventions targeting specific objectives with minimal force applied at exactly calculated points of vulnerability. This represented a form of warfare that conventional garrison forces, trained for territorial defense and force projection, were structurally ill-suited to counter. German command's response to Operation Basalt revealed the regime's characteristic blend of tactical adaptation and ideological rigidity. On the tactical level, security protocols throughout occupied territories received immediate enhancement. Increased patrols, improved communications, additional defensive positions, mandatory security briefings emphasizing commando capabilities. Garrison commanders who had treated previous directives as optional guidelines now faced serious consequences for security failures. Resources flowed toward coastal defense improvements, specialized counter-commando training, and intelligence operations targeting British espionage networks. The institutional machinery of the Wehrmacht, whatever its ideological limitations, retained capacity for learning from operational failures and implementing practical countermeasures. Yet simultaneously, Hitler issued the infamous Commando Order mandating that captured commandos be executed rather than treated as prisoners of war, a directive that revealed the regime's profound discomfort with enemy forces who operated outside conventional military frameworks and threatened German control through means traditional doctrine hadn't anticipated. The order transformed tactical acknowledgement of commando effectiveness into an admission of psychological vulnerability. These enemy forces were so threatening to German operational security and garrison morale that they couldn't be allowed to survive capture. The order constituted practical admission that conventional military responses had proven inadequate against unconventional threats. Weber found himself in an ethically impossible position following the Commando Order's implementation. As a professional soldier trained in traditional military codes emphasizing honorable treatment of prisoners, the order contradicted fundamental principles he had learned as defining warfare between civilized nations. Yet, as an officer in the Wehrmacht, during the Third Reich's increasingly desperate Middle War years, refusing to implement orders from Supreme Command meant facing charges of insubordination or defeatism that could result in execution. He existed in the moral gray zone that characterized many German officers who retained conventional ethical frameworks while serving a regime whose ideology increasingly diverged from traditional military values. The practical impact of the commando order proved counterproductive to German strategic interests. Rather than deterring commando operations, it gave British forces additional motivation for aggressive action, while simultaneously ensuring that captured commandos had nothing to lose by resisting to the death rather than surrendering. The order also damaged Wehrmacht credibility among occupied populations who witnessed German forces executing prisoners in violation of established laws of war, undermining the occupation authorities' efforts to present themselves as legitimate governing powers rather than brutal occupiers. Most significantly, from a military intelligence perspective, the order meant German interrogators couldn't extract information from captured commandos about British operational capabilities, training methods, and future plans, intelligence that would have been valuable for improving defensive measures. Weber observed his fellow officers struggling with similar ethical conflicts between duty and conscience. Some implemented the order with ideological enthusiasm, viewing commandos as irregular forces operating outside legitimate military frameworks, and therefore deserving summary execution. Others sought ways to avoid implementation while maintaining plausible deniability, transferring prisoners to other commands before execution orders could be carried out, claiming commandos had been killed during capture attempts, or interpreting the order narrowly to exclude prisoners who surrendered before being clearly identified as commandos. The variety of responses revealed the Wehrmacht's internal moral fragmentation, as the war's character evolved from conventional territorial conquest to increasingly desperate defense against enemies who refused to conform to German expectations about their capabilities or their will to continue fighting. The broader pattern became undeniable. Every aspect of the war was developing in directions that contradicted the assumptions upon which Germany had entered the conflict. The enemy forces that should have been defeated or deterred continued operating with increasing sophistication. The occupied territories that should have been pacified required constant vigilance against resistance and commando action. The ideological certainties that should have sustained morale increasingly conflicted with operational realities that demanded practical adaptation regardless of ideological preferences. Weber watched these contradictions accumulate, each one adding weight to the growing sense that the war's trajectory had diverged catastrophically from what German leadership had promised. By late 1943, the warnings about commando capabilities that had seemed excessive or paranoid 18 months earlier had become standard doctrine throughout German-occupied Europe. Training manuals included extensive sections on countering special operations. Security briefings emphasized commando threats as equivalent to conventional military actions. Defensive planning allocated resources toward protecting against infiltration and rapid assault, rather than solely preparing for sustained conventional attacks. The institutional learning curve that began with dismissive intelligence assessments had culminated in comprehensive doctrinal recognition that British commandos represented a permanent, professional, and highly capable threat, requiring constant defensive attention. Yet this recognition came too late to prevent the accumulated damage that commando operations had inflicted on German strategic position. The raids had destroyed critical infrastructure, dry docks, radar installations, factories, communications facilities that required months or years to repair or replace. They had captured hundreds of prisoners whose interrogations provided British intelligence with detailed information about German defensive capabilities, force dispositions, and operational plans. They had tied down thousands of German troops in coastal defense roles when those troops were desperately needed on Eastern and Mediterranean fronts, where the war's outcome was actually being decided. Perhaps most significantly, they had demonstrated to occupied populations that German control wasn't absolute, that resistance was possible, that liberation might not be a fantasy maintained by governments in exile. Weber recognized that the commando threat, while tactically significant, formed part of a broader pattern of Allied military development that contradicted every German assumption about enemy capabilities. The massive bombing campaigns over German cities demonstrated industrial capacity that should have been crippled by years of war. The successful amphibious operations in North Africa and Sicily showed coordination between naval, ground, and air forces that required institutional sophistication supposedly beyond democratic militaries. The steady improvement in Allied tactical effectiveness indicated learning organizations that adapted to German methods rather than rigid bureaucracies bound by doctrinaire thinking. Each development suggested that German leadership had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of its adversaries, mistaking temporary defensive posture for permanent weakness, confusing strategic patience for lack of capability. The warnings German officers now issued to their troops about never underestimating commandos carried implications that extended far beyond tactical advice about defensive procedures. They represented implicit acknowledgement that the Wehrmacht had entered the war with dangerously inaccurate assessments of enemy capabilities, that ideological assumptions about national and racial superiority had produced intelligence failures with catastrophic operational consequences, and that the confident predictions of quick victory had given way to desperate defensive fighting against enemies who had proven far more formidable than propaganda had suggested. The warnings admitted, without explicitly saying so, that German forces were no longer the unmatched military power they had believed themselves to be in 1940. The personal transformation Weber experienced paralleled the Wehrmacht's broader institutional evolution from arrogant certainty to hard-earned respect for enemy capabilities. He had begun his military career within a culture that emphasized German exceptionalism, the belief that superior training, equipment, doctrine, and fighting spirit made Wehrmacht forces inherently superior to any potential adversary. This confidence had been validated, or seemed to be validated, by the spectacular victories of 1939 to 1941, when German forces conquered Poland, France, and much of the Soviet Union with apparent ease. The narrative of invincibility became self-reinforcing. Victories proved German superiority, which justified confidence in future victories, which informed planning assumptions that enemy forces would collapse when confronted with Wehrmacht offensive action. The commando raids forced gradual abandonment of this comfortable certainty. Each successful British operation provided evidence that contradicted official narratives about enemy weakness and German invincibility. The accumulation of evidence, captured documents showing sophisticated planning, prisoner interrogations revealing extensive training, operational analysis demonstrating tactical proficiency, made denial increasingly difficult to sustain. Weber watched his own assumptions erode under the pressure of repeated contradictions between what he'd been told about British capabilities and what British forces actually accomplished. The process was psychologically painful, requiring admission that he'd believed comfortable lies rather than uncomfortable truths, that his confidence had rested on propaganda rather than accurate assessment of military realities. This personal disillusionment mirrored broader trends throughout the Wehrmacht's officer corps. Veterans of the Eastern Front returned with stories about Soviet tactical improvements, industrial capacity that produced weapons in quantities Germany couldn't match, and fighting spirit that contradicted propaganda about Slavic inferiority. Officers who had participated in North African campaigns described American forces learning rapidly from early defeats and adapting with organizational flexibility that German doctrine didn't anticipate. The accumulated experiences created unofficial networks of knowledge that contradicted official assessments, with officers sharing realistic evaluations in private conversations while maintaining required public adherence to optimistic propaganda narratives. Weber found himself inhabiting this dual consciousness, expressing official confidence in German victory while privately recognizing the accumulating evidence of Allied superiority and critical capabilities. He issued orders emphasizing security protocols while knowing those protocols might not be sufficient against enemy forces, who had consistently demonstrated ability to overcome German defensive measures. He maintained disciplinary standards and tactical training, while wondering whether his garrison's eventual fate was predetermined by strategic factors beyond any individual commander's control. The psychological burden of this contradiction, knowing the truth while being required to act as if you believed the lie, proved exhausting in ways that combat stress never had been. By 1944, as Allied forces prepared for the Normandy invasion, the role of commando operations in degrading German defensive effectiveness became fully apparent. The raids that German command had initially dismissed as propaganda gestures had systematically gathered intelligence about coastal defenses, tested defensive responses, captured prisoners who revealed deployment patterns, and tied down troops in garrison roles that prevented their concentration at strategically critical points. The cumulative impact of dozens of relatively small operations, each individually causing limited damage, had been to create uncertainty throughout German command about where the main invasion would strike, to force dispersal of defensive forces across hundreds of miles of coastline. and to demonstrate that Atlantic Wall fortifications could be penetrated by determined assault with proper planning and preparation. Weber, promoted and transferred to defensive positions in Normandy's sector, found himself implementing lessons learned from 3 years of commando operations while simultaneously preparing for the conventional invasion those operations had been preparing. The defensive doctrine he now followed bore little resemblance to the confident, centralized control that had characterized Wehrmacht operations in 1940. Instead, it emphasized defensive depth, rapid response capabilities, redundant communications, and constant vigilance against infiltration, all measures developed in response to commando tactics that had consistently exploited German vulnerabilities in centralized command structures and predictable defensive patterns. The irony wasn't lost on him. The British forces that German intelligence had dismissed as broken and ineffective in 1940 had spent 4 years systematically developing capabilities that would enable the largest amphibious invasion in military history. The Commandos, who German propaganda had ridiculed as desperate raiders, conducting meaningless gestures, had been testing and probing German defenses, gathering intelligence, refining tactics, and training the specialized units that would spearhead the Normandy landings. Every raid that German command had dismissed as tactically insignificant had actually been contributing to a strategic preparation that was now reaching culmination. The British hadn't been conducting random harassment operations. They had been methodically preparing for this moment, and German forces had failed to recognize the pattern until far too late to implement effective countermeasures. The warnings Weber now issued to the troops under his command carried weight earned through bitter experience. Never underestimate the Commandos wasn't generic tactical advice, but distilled wisdom from years of operational failures, resulting from exactly that underestimation. It meant acknowledging that the enemy possessed capabilities German doctrine hadn't anticipated, that previous intelligence assessments had been dangerously wrong, and that comfortable assumptions about German superiority had been replaced by hard-earned respect for adversaries who had proven themselves formidable through consistent operational success against supposedly superior Wehrmacht forces. The climactic revelation came not during the Normandy invasion itself, but in the weeks afterward, as Weber watched Allied forces establish beachheads that German counterattacks couldn't dislodge, as specialized units that bore clear resemblance to the commandos he'd faced in the Channel Islands operated behind German lines with devastating effectiveness, as the entire defensive strategy that should have thrown invaders back into the sea collapsed under the weight of Allied operational superiority that German planning hadn't adequately anticipated. The moment of absolute clarity arrived during a briefing, where intelligence officers presented analysis of Allied operational methods, their voices carrying none of the confidence that had characterized similar briefings 4 years earlier. The analysis revealed patterns Weber had witnessed in microcosm through commando operations now manifest at strategic scale. Allied forces demonstrated coordination between services that German command structures couldn't match, adapted rapidly to German defensive responses with organizational flexibility that Wehrmacht doctrine didn't accommodate, and maintained logistical support that enabled sustained offensive operations despite German efforts at interdiction. The specialized units operating behind lines, Rangers, Commandos, airborne forces, weren't exceptional forces conducting isolated operations, but integrated components of a military system that had learned to employ specialized capabilities as standard operational practice rather than desperate expedient. What struck Weber most forcefully wasn't the specific tactical details but the broader implication. The 4 years of British commando operations hadn't been peripheral to the war's main developments, but integral to Allied institutional learning about how to conduct modern warfare. The raids had served as testing grounds for tactics, training laboratories for specialized forces, proving grounds for equipment, and intelligence gathering operations that systematically mapped German vulnerabilities. The entire commando program, which German command had dismissed as strategically meaningless, had actually been part of a methodical preparation for conventional operations that was now demonstrating results in the catastrophic collapse of German defensive positions across France. The warnings he'd received years earlier about never underestimating commandos suddenly took on fuller meaning. They hadn't been warnings about isolated tactical threats, but recognition that these forces represented a fundamentally different approach to military operations, one that emphasized intelligence over force, precision over mass, adaptation over doctrine, and patient preparation over immediate action. The British had spent 4 years developing this approach, while German forces remained locked in conventional operational frameworks that proved increasingly inadequate against adversaries who had learned to fight in ways Wehrmacht doctrine hadn't anticipated. The underestimation hadn't been of Commandos specifically, but of the entire Allied institutional capacity for military innovation and systematic preparation for the war's decisive operations. The German officers' warnings about never underestimating the Commandos, issued in increasingly urgent terms from 1942 through the war's end, represented more than tactical advice about defensive procedures. They constituted institutional acknowledgement that the Wehrmacht had entered World War II with fundamentally flawed assessments of enemy capabilities, that ideological assumptions about inherent superiority had produced intelligence failures with catastrophic operational consequences, and that the comfortable certainties of 1940 had given way to desperate recognition that adversaries previously dismissed as inferior had developed military capabilities matching or exceeding German standards in critical areas. For officers like Weber who lived through this transformation, the evolution from confident dismissal to respectful acknowledgement of enemy capabilities came at profound personal cost. It required abandoning beliefs that had sustained them through years of service, admitting that their training and doctrine had proven inadequate against adversaries who operated according to different principles, and accepting that the victory they'd been promised was increasingly unlikely, as the strategic balance shifted decisively against German forces. The psychological burden of this recognition, understanding that everything they'd believed about the war's trajectory had been wrong, while simultaneously being required to continue fighting in service of a cause they knew was lost, proved as damaging as physical combat to many who experienced it. The broader historical lesson extended beyond the specific circumstances of World War II. The German military's failure to accurately assess British commando capabilities demonstrated the dangers of allowing ideological preferences to override objective analysis, of confusing propaganda narratives with strategic intelligence, and of maintaining institutional cultures that punish honest reporting when it contradicts desired conclusions. Modern military organizations study this failure not to ridicule German incompetence. The Wehrmacht remained highly capable in many operational areas, but to understand how sophisticated military institutions can systematically misunderstand adversary capabilities when organizational culture prioritizes confirming existing assumptions over testing them against observable evidence. The warnings German officers issued to their troops, "Never underestimate the Commandos," echo across decades as reminders that military effectiveness requires honest assessment of both friendly and enemy capabilities, that comfortable assumptions about superiority can prove catastrophically wrong when tested against determined adversaries, and that the most dangerous intelligence failure is convincing yourself that what you want to be true actually is true. Those who heed these warnings, who maintain humility about their own capabilities while respecting adversary competence, position themselves to avoid the painful learning experience that transformed confident German officers into men who understood too late that they had consistently underestimated enemies who proved far more capable than propaganda had suggested.